My name is Nathan Cole, and I told a joke that became my whole life. I'm 30, and I manage a warehouse in Tacoma, where the days bleed together until you can't tell Monday from Friday. I'd lived across from Claire for 8 months without learning her last name, until one Friday night when I was too tired to think straight. I saw her in the hall, and I joked, "Let's run away together." And she looked right at me and said, "Okay." Before I could say I was kidding, she turned to pack a bag, and I stood there wondering if I was about to ruin her life or save my own. The hallway light was buzzing the way it always did. My feet felt stuck to the linoleum. Her door clicked shut, and I was still standing there with my keys in my hand. I thought about pretending none of it happened, but something kept my mouth closed. Maybe it was the way she had looked at me. She hadn't seemed surprised or confused. She had seemed ready. 5 minutes later, her door opened again.
She had a small duffel bag and a travel mug. She said, "I just need to know if we're actually doing this." I didn't have an answer, but I found myself nodding anyway. We walked down to the parking lot without speaking. The night air was cold, and it smelled like asphalt and rain that hadn't fallen yet. I unlocked my old sedan, and she got into the passenger seat like she had done it 100 times before. I put the car in drive, and we pulled out onto the street. The radio was off. The heater was on low. I could hear her breathing beside me, calm and even, like she was sitting in a doctor's waiting room instead of a car driving toward nowhere. I didn't know where we were going. I got onto I-5 North because it was the only direction that felt like leaving. The highway was mostly empty at that hour. The streetlights passed over the windshield one by one, and neither of us said anything for the first 20 minutes. I kept my eyes on the road and tried to figure out what I was doing. Every mile felt like a thread being pulled from the life I had built in Tacoma. The warehouse, the bills, the empty apartment, the refrigerator with nothing but condiments and leftover Chinese food. It was all still there, waiting for me to come back. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like it owned me. She shifted in her seat and pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. It was a blue jacket with a small tear near the cuff that she kept running her thumb over. I noticed that about her right away. She touched things when she was nervous. The edge of her sleeve, the zipper on her bag, the rim of her travel mug. It was like she needed to prove the world was solid before she could trust it. Finally, she said, "Do you have a destination in mind?" I didn't. I told her I was thinking about ocean shores. My family used to go there when I was a kid, before my parents split up and before everything got complicated. She nodded and said, "Ocean shores sounds fine." She said it like I had suggested a restaurant instead of a 5-hour escape from our lives. I glanced over at her. The dashboard light was hitting her face in a way that made her look younger than I had thought she was. She had fine lines around her eyes that I had never noticed before, the kind that come from squinting at a computer screen or crying in private. She caught me looking and didn't turn away. Most people would have looked out the window or checked their phone, but she just looked back at me with an expression I couldn't read. It was more like she was waiting to see what kind of person I turned out to be. That was worse, because I didn't know the answer either. The small talk started after we stopped for gas in Olympia. I bought 2 coffees, and she bought a bag of sunflower seeds. She handed me the coffee through the window while I pumped the gas, and our fingers touched for a second. It was the first time I had touched her in 8 months of living across the hall. The gas station lights were bright and empty. A truck driver walked past us with a cup of coffee and didn't look twice. That was the thing about the middle of nowhere. Nobody cared who you were or why you were there. It made the whole trip feel more possible, like we had stepped outside the rules that normally kept us apart. Back on the road, she asked me why I had said it. I thought about lying. I thought about making up something funny or casual, but I was too tired for that. I told her the truth. I said I had been working 14-hour shifts all week, and my brain had stopped filtering words before they left my mouth. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. I wasn't thinking either."
That should have scared me. Two people who weren't thinking, driving north on a highway with no plan and no reason. But it didn't scare me. It felt like the first honest thing that had happened to me in years. She started eating the sunflower seeds one by one, cracking each shell between her teeth with a sound that reminded me of my grandfather sitting on his porch. It was a small, ordinary noise, but it filled the car with something familiar. I asked her what she did for work. She said she was a bookkeeper for a small business in Tacoma, mostly working from home. She said the numbers made sense to her in a way that people never did. I told her I understood that. The warehouse had its own kind of math. Boxes in, boxes out, inventory counts that either matched or didn't. At least with boxes, you always knew where you stood. We arrived at the motel a little after 9. It was one of those small places with a neon sign that buzzed and a parking lot full of pickup trucks. The woman at the front desk didn't ask any questions. She just took my credit card and handed me 2 room keys. I gave Claire the key to the room with the better view. She insisted on splitting the cost. We argued about it for 30 seconds in the hallway, and she won. I stood in my room and looked at the 2 beds and the thin carpet and the window that faced the ocean. I couldn't see the water in the dark, but I could hear it. The sound was steady and patient, like something that had been waiting a long time for me to notice it. I lay down on the bed closest to the window and listened to the ocean until I fell asleep. The motel room was small and clean and smelled like bleach and old carpet. I showered and changed into the only clean shirt I had brought, a flannel I usually wore for yard work. When I knocked on her door, she opened it wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like it had been washed too many times. She had pulled her hair back with a clip, and I could see the shape of her neck. I hadn't noticed that before, either. She smelled like soap and something warm that I couldn't name. We walked down to a diner at the end of the block. It was one of those places with vinyl booths and a jukebox that played country songs from the 1990s. The waitress called us honey before she even took our order. Claire ordered pancakes, and I ordered eggs and toast. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way coffee should be at 10 o'clock at night. There was a couple in the corner booth arguing about something quiet and serious, and a truck driver eating pie by himself at the counter. Nobody looked at us twice. In Tacoma, people knew me as the warehouse manager who worked too much. Here, we were just 2 people eating pancakes in the middle of nowhere. It felt like freedom, even if we both knew it was only temporary. She started talking while we ate. She told me about her parents' divorce when she was 12 and how her mother had moved them to 3 different states in 2 years. She learned early that keeping bags packed made goodbyes easier. She said it like she was reading from a report, flat and factual, but her hands were shaking a little when she cut her pancakes. I didn't ask her to explain more. I just listened. The jukebox changed to a song I recognized from my childhood. Something about lost love and open roads. Claire stopped cutting her pancakes and looked up at me. She said, "I don't usually tell people this stuff. I don't know why I'm telling you." I told her maybe that was the point. Maybe we needed to be somewhere nobody knew us, so we could say things we normally kept locked up. She thought about that for a moment, then went back to her pancakes. But her hands weren't shaking anymore. I told her about the warehouse. I told her about the weight of being responsible for inventory that never stopped moving, and the way the work had swallowed my 20s without me noticing. I told her about the girlfriend who left 2 years ago because I wasn't really there even when I was. I said her name was Amanda and that I didn't blame her for leaving. Claire nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. She asked me what I wanted when I was younger, before the warehouse and the overtime and the quiet apartment. I told her I used to draw. Nothing good, just buildings and machines and sometimes landscapes from places I had never been. She asked if I still drew. I said I couldn't remember the last time I had picked up a pencil. She didn't say that was sad. She just said, maybe you should try again. Like it was that simple. Like I had been waiting for someone to give me permission. After dinner, we walked down to the beach. The sand was cold and damp, and the wind cut right through my flannel. There were lights from fishing boats far out on the water, small yellow dots that looked like they belonged to another world. Claire walked ahead of me with her hands in her pockets. Then she stopped and turned around. She said she had been in Tacoma for 10 months and hadn't made a single friend. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. I told her I had lived across from her for 8 months and never even knew her last name. She laughed at that. It was a real laugh, surprised and open, and it made something in my chest loosen. We stood there on the cold sand and laughed, like two people who had finally found the only other person in the world who understood the joke. The wind picked up, and she shivered. Without thinking, I took off my jacket and handed it to her. She looked at it like she wasn't sure if she should accept. Then she put it on. It was too big for her, and the sleeves hung past her wrists. She rolled them up and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't gratitude. It was something deeper, something that looked like recognition. Like she had been cold for a long time and someone had finally noticed. Back at the motel, the hallway felt too narrow. I walked her to her door, and she slid the key into the lock. The click sounded loud in the quiet. She looked at me for a moment, and I thought she might say something important. Instead, she just said good night and went inside. I stood there for a few seconds before I walked back to my room. The space between our doors had never felt so wide. I lay in bed and listened to the ocean through the thin walls. I thought about knocking on her door, but the moment felt too fragile, like a soap bubble that would burst if I touched it. So I closed my eyes and let the sound of the ocean pull me under. The storm hit around 2 a.m. I woke up to thunder that sounded like something heavy falling over in the warehouse. The wind was shaking the window in its frame, and rain was hitting the glass in hard, sideways bursts. I got up and checked the parking lot. My car was still there, but the trees were bending so far they looked like they might snap. Then the power went out. The neon sign died, the hallway lights went dark, and the television down the hall cut off in the middle of a laugh track. I stood in the dark room and listened to the storm. A few minutes later, there was a knock at my door. It was Claire. She was holding a flashlight and wearing the sweater she had worn to dinner. She said her room was on the side of the building where a tree branch had hit the roof, and she didn't want to stay there alone. I stepped aside and let her in. The room felt different with her in it. It felt smaller, but not in a bad way. It felt more full, like the air had been too thin before and neither of us had noticed. She sat on the edge of the bed near the window. I sat on the other bed. The flashlight between us made sharp shadows on the wall. We listened to the wind for a while without talking. I could hear her breathing across the small space between the beds. It was faster than normal, the way people breathe when they're trying not to cry. I wanted to say something that would make her feel safe, but I didn't know what that would be. So I stayed quiet and let the storm do the talking. Then I made a mistake. I looked at her in the dark room with the storm outside, and I said, I guess we really did run away together. I meant it as a joke, the same kind of joke that had started all of this, but it landed wrong. She went very still, the kind of still that means something is breaking underneath. She asked me what I was really asking. I didn't know how to answer, so I pushed harder. I asked her what she was really running from. I asked why she had been packed and ready to leave before I ever opened my mouth. I thought I was being brave. I was being stupid. She stood up from the bed and walked over to the window. The glass was rattling in its frame, and the rain was running down it in thick rivers. She put her hand on the glass like she was testing whether it was real. Her reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger, someone I had never met. I realized I didn't know anything about her past. I had just assumed she was lonely the same way I was. But loneliness comes in different flavors. Hers had a name and a history. Mine was just empty. She exploded, not with shouting, but with words that came out sharp and fast, like she had been holding them in for months. She told me about a man named Marcus. She told me they had been together for 2 years, and that he had decided where she went and who she saw and what she wore. She told me he used to say she was too broken to be loved by anyone else. She told me she had left him 3 months ago and had been planning to leave Tacoma ever since, just to get far enough away that he couldn't find her. The truth hit me like a physical weight. She hadn't said yes because of me. She had said yes because she was already running. I was just the excuse she had been waiting for. I felt something close my throat. I stood up and started putting on my boots. I told her I would sleep in the car so she could have the room. The floor was cold under my feet. My boots were half on, and I was bent over tying the laces when she grabbed me. Her hand was cold, but her grip was strong. She said my name in a voice I hadn't heard before. Not the calm voice from the car, not the careful voice from the diner. This was her real voice, stripped of everything she used to protect herself. It shook a little, but it didn't break. She said, "Yes, I was running, but I didn't have to get in your car. I had a bus ticket in my drawer. I had enough money for a motel in Portland. I had options." She let go of my arm and stepped back. "But I got in your car, and that means something, even if you don't know what yet." I sat back down. The rain was pounding the windows so hard I couldn't see anything outside. We sat there while the storm started to quiet down, neither of us sleeping, neither of us talking. But we were both still there, and somehow that was enough. She told me more about Marcus. She told me about the way he would bring her flowers after he yelled at her, like the flowers could fix what his words broke. She told me she still flinched when men raised their voices, even when they weren't angry at her. I didn't say anything heroic. I didn't tell her she was strong or that Marcus was wrong. I just handed her my jacket because she was shivering, and I didn't ask for it back. She put it on and pulled the collar up around her neck. We sat there until the storm passed without either of us saying a word. But neither of us had left. The morning after the storm was different. The air was clean and sharp, and the sky was the kind of blue that only comes after bad weather. We walked into town for breakfast at a small cafe that smelled like cinnamon and fried bacon. The waitress recognized us from the night before and didn't ask any questions. She just poured our coffee and left us alone. After breakfast, we found a thrift store 2 blocks from the main road. It was full of old furniture and clothes that smelled like other people's houses. Claire held up a hat with a wide brim and a purple feather and made me try it on. I looked ridiculous. She laughed so hard she had to lean against a rack of winter coats. I took the hat off and put it back, but I kept the image of her laughing. It felt like something I needed to remember. Down the street, there was a bookshop with creaky wooden floors and shelves that leaned slightly to the left. Claire moved through it like she knew the language. She ran her fingers over the spines without reading the titles, like she was reading something else in the texture of the cloth and paper. She found a first edition of a novel I had loved when I was a teenager. It was a story about a boy who ran away to sea. I hadn't thought about that book in 15 years. She handed it to me and said, "You should have this." I tried to pay her for it, but she wouldn't let me. She said some things shouldn't cost money. I put the book in my jacket pocket, and I could feel it there for the rest of the day, heavy and real. We ate pancakes at a lunch counter that spun around on chrome stools. The syrup was too sweet and the pancakes were too thick, but we ate them anyway. She was different in the daylight, quicker to laugh, more generous with small kindnesses. She refilled my coffee when the waitress wasn't looking, and she tore her napkin into thin strips while she talked about nothing in particular. I caught myself watching her hands when she turned the pages of the book she had bought. I noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on the menu. Then my phone buzzed. It was my boss, asking if I could come in on Sunday to cover a shipment that had arrived early. I looked at the phone, and then I looked at Claire. She was drawing a smiley face in the condensation on her water glass. I turned the phone off and put it in my pocket. She saw me do it. She didn't say anything, but her expression changed. She knew what it cost me. She knew that the warehouse ran on people who never said no, and that I had just said no for the first time in years. She reached across the counter and put her hand over mine for a second. Then she took it back and went back to her pancakes. It was a small gesture, but it felt like she had handed me something important. I just didn't have the words for it yet. We drove to the beach after lunch. The tide was out, and the wet sand stretched for what looked like miles. We walked far out toward the water, collecting shells that the storm had washed up. She found a piece of sea glass, green and smooth, and she held it up to the light. She said she was going to keep it. I told her she should. She stopped walking and looked at me. The wind was blowing her hair across her face, and she didn't push it away. She said, "I don't want to go back tonight. I don't want to go back to Tacoma and pretend this didn't happen." I looked at the ocean, and then I looked at her. I said, "I don't either." So we stayed another night. The decision felt bigger than the words we used to make it. We drove back to the motel, and the woman at the front desk gave us the same 2 rooms without asking any questions. But this time, when we stood in the hallway with our keys, the space between us felt different. It felt smaller. It felt more like a choice than a wall. Claire looked at her door, and then she looked at mine. She said, "I think I want to try those cards tonight." I told her I had a deck in my glove compartment from a camping trip I took 2 summers ago. She nodded and went into her room to change. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of the ocean through the open window at the end of the corridor. Then I went into my room and found the cards. They were worn at the edges, and the box was soft from humidity. But they would work. They would be enough. Sunday morning was gray and quiet. The car felt smaller than it had on the way up, like the silence between us had grown physical edges. We packed our bags without speaking much. The motel room looked different in daylight, more worn and less magical. I checked out while Claire waited in the car. The woman at the front desk asked if we had a nice stay. I said yes. It was the only true thing I had said to a stranger in months. We stopped at the same gas station on the way back. This time we didn't buy anything. We just used the bathroom and got back in the car. The highway south felt like a countdown. Every mile marker was a reminder that the weekend was ending and the real world was getting closer. She got quiet around Centralia. Not the comfortable quiet from the drive up. This was a different quiet, the kind that means someone is rehearsing hard words in their head. I got quiet too. I was thinking about what she had told me about Marcus, and about the bus ticket in her drawer, and about how easy it would be for her to use that ticket now that the weekend was over. I was thinking about my own ex, Amanda, and the way she had looked at me when she left. She had said I wasn't really present even when my body was in the room. She was right. We were both hurt by people who had made us feel invisible. That was the thing we had in common, the thing that had made the weekend possible. But it also made us terrified that this was just another illusion. That Monday morning would come, and we would go back to our separate apartments and our separate lives, and this would become just a story we told ourselves when the loneliness got too loud. I almost said something real at a red light in Olympia. I opened my mouth to tell her that I didn't want to go back to the way things were, but the light changed, and the car behind us honked, and the moment passed. We drove the rest of the way in silence. It wasn't the angry silence from before the storm, and it wasn't the comfortable silence from the drive up. It was the silence of two people carrying something heavy between them, something they both wanted to set down but didn't know how. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. She kept her hands in her lap. We both pretended that the weekend had been enough. We both knew we were lying. We pulled into the apartment parking lot at dusk. The building looked exactly the same as it had on Friday, but it felt smaller. She looked up at her window and said, "It looks smaller than I remembered." I knew what she meant. Everything looks smaller after you've seen something bigger. She didn't go inside right away. She stood at the front door of the building with her bag over her shoulder, and she didn't move. I stood by the car with my keys in my hand, the same keys I had been holding when this started. She turned around and looked at me across the parking lot. The street light above her was flickering on, casting a yellow glow that made her look like she was standing on a stage. I counted 12 steps as I walked toward her, and each one felt like I was leaving something behind. When I got close enough to see her face, I stopped. I said, "I meant it. Not the joke. The part about wanting to leave with you. I meant that." My voice was rough and uneven, but the words were clear. I had been holding them in since Friday night, and I was tired of the wait. She didn't answer right away. She studied my face like she was seeing it for the first time. Her eyes moved from my eyes to my mouth and back again, and I let her look. I had nothing to hide anymore. Then she said, "I know. I knew the minute you didn't laugh." She took a breath and let it out slow. "You looked at me like I was real. Nobody has looked at me like that in a long time." She reached out and took my hand. It wasn't dramatic. She just fit her fingers between mine like she had been practicing the motion in her head. Her hand was warm and dry and steady. She said, "I don't want to run anymore, but I don't want to stop either. I don't want to go back to my apartment and close the door and pretend we're still strangers." I squeezed her hand. I told her we didn't have to. I told her my apartment was closer and my bed was bigger and the view wasn't any worse than hers. She laughed, and it sounded like relief. We walked inside together. We didn't go to separate apartments. We went to mine because it was closer, and because the distance between us had finally collapsed to nothing. Her bag bumped against my leg as we climbed the stairs, and I could smell her shampoo in the narrow hallway. It smelled like the ocean. It smelled like home. My apartment was dark when I opened the door. I hadn't left the light on, and the only illumination came from the street light outside the window. She walked in ahead of me and set her bag down by the couch. Then she turned around and looked at the room. She looked at the books on the shelf and the worn armchair and the photograph of my parents on the windowsill. She took it all in without saying anything. Then she looked at me and said, "It suits you." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just stood there in the doorway, watching her make herself at home in a space she had never seen before. And I thought about how empty it had felt that morning, and how full it felt now. Monday morning came the way it always did. The alarm went off at 5, and the warehouse still needed me. But when I rolled over, she was there. Her hair was spread across my pillow, and her breathing was slow and even. The world hadn't changed, but I was different now. And that was enough. If you want to hear what happens next, subscribe. Some doors you don't open until someone else is standing beside you, ready to walk through.